I'm Lou Urenik, a professor of journalism here at Boston University, and today, with our distinguished panel of Pulitzer winners, we're going to examine the important topic of rules of engagement, advocacy and emotion in journalism. I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. To my immediate left, Steve Kurkjian is the senior metropolitan editor for the Boston Globe and one of 3 founding members of the Globe's investigative spotlight team. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for local investigative specialized reporting on 2 occasions. In 1972 for exposing corruption in Somerville, Mass., and in 1980 for coverage of Boston's transit system. He also shared in the 2003 Pulitzer for Public Service for investigating sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. His article on the Massachusetts prison system was acknowledged by Washington Monthly as the best story in U.S. newspapers for March in 2004. Next is Helen Ubinas. Helen is a columnist for the Hartford Courant, where she writes on local and national issues, from same-sex marriage to the death penalty. In 1999, she was a member of the Courant reporting team whose coverage of a Connecticut lottery worker's shooting rampage won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting. Ubinas' work has also been recognized by the Connecticut chapter of Society of Professional Journalists, the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and the New England Associated Press News Executives Association. And finally, Mark Thompson on the panel. Mark is a senior correspondent at Time, where he has played a key role in Time's coverage of the Iraq War and its aftermath. In 1985, when reporting for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, he received the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for his reports about fatal flaws in the Army's Huey and Cobra helicopters that resulted in the deaths of 250 U.S. servicemen. 2 of the panelists who had been scheduled to be with us, Patricia Maldonado and Joan Vinoki, unfortunately had last-minute conflicts, emergencies, and are unable to attend, and they send their apologies. The goal this morning is to explore the question of whether news coverage of recent high-profile events suggests that we may need to break out of some of our conventions as journalists. I'm speaking now of disturbing the deeply held conventions of balance and detachment in order to connect more directly to our readers and viewers and to recapture our purpose and passion as journalists. There is a wide range of views on this matter, and there may not be a simple answer. In fact, I expect that we're going to have some disagreement and debate, and it'll be interesting to hear your reactions to this question. Now, the title of the panel has 2 strands. One is the question of whether the emotional engagement of reporters is acceptable or advisable when they cover a story that kindles in them a sense of outrage. And the other is a consideration of whether we, as advocates of a truth-telling mission, should more frequently and more forcefully break out of coverage that is dominated either by words and pictures of government officials or by our insistence on representing all points of view in a story. I'd like to play a video clip of Anderson Cooper interviewing Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, which aired on September 2nd, 4 days after Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast, which I think speaks to some of these issues and provides an interesting illustration of some of the things we want to talk about. So Chad, if you could, we're going to play 4 minutes of the CNN interview.
Joining me from Baton Rouge is Louisiana Senator Mary Landrieu. Senator, appreciate you joining us tonight. Does the federal government bear responsibility for what is happening now? Should they apologize for what is happening now?
Anderson, there will be plenty of time to discuss all of those issues about why and how and what and if. But Anderson, as you understand, and all of the producers and directors of CNN and the news networks, this situation is very serious, and it's going to demand all of our full attention through the hours, through the night, through the days. Let me just say a few things. Thank President Clinton and former President Bush for their strong statements of support and comfort today. I thank all the leaders that are coming to Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama to our help and rescue. We are grateful for the military assets that are being brought to bear. I want to thank Senator Frist and Senator Reid for their extraordinary efforts, Anderson. Tonight, I don't know if you've heard, maybe you all have announced it, but Congress is going to an unprecedented session to pass a $10 billion supplemental bill tonight to keep FEMA and the Red Cross up and operating.
Excuse me, Senator, I'm sorry for interrupting. I haven't heard that because for the last 4 days I've been seeing dead bodies in the streets here in Mississippi, and to listen to politicians thanking each other and complimenting each other, you know, I got to tell you, there are a lot of people here who are very upset and very angry and very frustrated, and when they hear politicians thanking one another, it just, you know, it kind of cuts them the wrong way right now, because literally there was a body on the streets of this town yesterday being eaten by rats because this woman had been laying in the street for 48 hours, and there's not enough facilities to take her up. Do you get the anger that is out here?
Anderson, I have the anger inside of me. Most of the homes in my family have been destroyed. Our homes have been destroyed. I understand what you're saying, and I know all of those details. And the President of the United States knows those details. I'm not angry at anyone. I'm just expressing that it is so important for everyone in this nation to pull together for all military assets and all assets to be brought to bear to this situation. And I have every confidence that this country is as great and as strong as we can be to do that, and that effort is underway.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people here who are kind of ashamed of what is happening in this country right now, ashamed of what is happening in your state, certainly, and that's not to blame the people who are there. It's a desperate situation. But I guess, you know, no one seems to be taking responsibility. I mean, I know you say there's a time and a place for kind of, you know, looking back, but this seems to be the time and the place. I mean, there are people who want answers, and there are people who want someone to stand up and say, you know what, we should have done more. Are all the assets being brought to bear? I mean, today, for the first time, I'm seeing National Guard troops in this town.
Anderson, I know, and I know where you are, and I know what you're seeing. Believe me, we know it. And we understand, and there will be a time to talk about all of that. Trust me. I know what the people are suffering. The governor knows, the president knows, the military officials know, and they're trying to do the very best they can to stabilize the situation. Senator Vitter, our congressional delegation, all of us understand what is happening. We are doing our very, very best to get the situation under control, but I want to thank the president. He will be here tomorrow, we think, and the military is sending assets as we speak. So please, I understand. You might say I'm a politician, but I grew up in New Orleans. My father was the mayor of that city. I've represented that city my whole life, and it's just not New Orleans. It's St. Bernard and St. Tammany and Plaquemine Parish that have been completely underwater. Our levee system has failed. We need a lot of help, and the Congress has been wonderful to help us, and we need more help. Nobody's perfect, Anderson. Everybody has to stand up here, and I know you understand. So thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Well, I appreciate you joining us on the program tonight. I can only imagine how busy you are. Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you, Anderson.
I sat with Helen at dinner last night, and she says, "What do you have against Anderson Cooper?" And I said, "Well, he's just so good-looking." This interview generated a lot of talk and praise, and even an op-ed piece in the Washington Post. It became a symbol in some ways of a new assertiveness on the part of U.S. journalism, which had fallen, some people say, into a period of sluggishness, overt patriotism, and deference to power. The interview also seems to account for Cooper's recent ascent at CNN and his recent displacement of Aaron Brown as the primetime anchor for the cable network. Of Cooper, who has become something of a phenomenon following Katrina, CNN President John Klein said, "He's got a refreshing way of being the anti-anchor. He's just being himself. He's asking the questions you would like answered," and here I'll add some emphasis, he's getting involved. So there's the engagement. It worked in this case for CNN. But what about the advocacy? The word here is meant in its best sense, which is an engagement in search of truth, as opposed to conventions that possibly obscure the truth. The two, engagement and truth-telling, may have something in common, I would assert. My colleague at BU, Mike Berlin, had some interesting things to say to me on this topic in a recent email. Describing ethical issues that face journalists today, he noted that there have been numerous examples of good reporting that ignored the need to scout out balancing sources. Said Mike, after Katrina, the media appropriately scoffed at the balancing claims of government sources when it came to what was being done and could have been done for survivors and evacuees. End of Mike's quote. Then there's this from the online publication TomPaine.com, decidedly an advocacy website. It was addressing the recent uproar over the work of Judith Miller at the New York Times. According to Tom Paine, too many journalistic institutions are living in an idyllic past. The uniquely American notion of objective journalism, of reporting both perspectives and letting readers decide for themselves, while admirable, is increasingly meaningless. Continuing in TomPaine.com, Judith Miller of the New York Times liked to say the issue wasn't whether or not she got the story wrong, but that the sources were wrong, and the Times leadership took up this chant as well. Sorry, folks, the essence of good journalism is not reporting what people say, but figuring out who is telling the truth. And finally this, from Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel, who wrote that op-ed piece for the Washington Post. And I quote, "Many have lauded the news media's newfound passion, but the praise is by no means unanimous. The issue cuts to the heart of what it means to be a journalist at a time when the matter is in more doubt than ever. In a profession that pledges itself to suppressing self-interest to ensure credibility, are emotionalism and outrage ever appropriate?" End of quote. So with that question, I'd like to turn to our panelists, Pulitzer winners with lots of experience, for their thoughts. What can they tell us based on their long experience in the field, and how have they wrestled with this question in their careers? I'm going to turn to the panelists, and then we're going to open the session to questions, and I'm asked to remind you all that it would be really helpful if everybody spoke into the microphone, both on the panel here and also when we get to the Q&A period. So Steve, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the surprising thing is the reaction to an emotional engagement between a reporter and the subject of the person whom he's interviewing. As you can imagine, when a reporter, perhaps you don't, maybe that's the surprise of it, when a reporter sits down and engages, it's particularly in my work as an investigative reporter, engages someone whom I believe has a responsibility or accountability for a problem that I've been reporting on, that is a very passionate engagement. That is almost like an arm wrestling. And I am trying to, the reporter is trying to get that person to get beyond that person's blandishments and their pithy statements of someone else is to blame, to push them into the corner, to get them to be both as honest and as extemporaneous as possible. I have done it for 35 years at the Boston Globe. I did it to President Silber when there was during several times here on Boston University's campuses during controversies here. I have done it in the Oval Office with first President Bush in the late 1980s, and I've done it on any number of occasions at City Hall and State House. You want that engagement to be as passionate and as compelling as possible in order to get the person of responsibility, because that's why you're talking to that person. That's why he's talking to Senator Landrieu. She's one of the two most powerful federal officials in Louisiana, to try to get her to own up to the issues of responsibility and accountability. What I think is remarkable about this is that it's on air, but there is nothing unique about this engagement. From having spent more than 35 years now as an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe, I can tell you passion makes the stories that much more compelling. Most of the investigative reporting that I've done takes at least a month, if not 6 weeks, 2 months, 4 months, to engage and to complete. Those are long, dry periods in which that story is being born, and the questions remain more multiple than the answers. The passion, it's good to have passion in not advocacy, because advocacy implies you're giving up your sense of objectivity to the story, but your passion continues your commitment to the story. I think part of what's driven me is the fact that I'm a Boston boy, and by that I mean I grew up in the city, and I have a feeling of sort of familiarity with the issues that have long troubled the city, and the agencies of government that are responsible for those issues not being, for those controversies not being settled long ago. So whether it's hospitalization, whether it's education, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's environment, these issues are regulated or controlled at City Hall and State House and the federal government. And these are the issues that involve all of our lives, the lives of our residents, the lives of our public, the lives of our readers, and my life. And knowing that these issues have been dealt with poorly by the officials who run the government, absolutely makes me much more compelled to do a tougher job in my reporting. And you know, whether it's passion or commitment, I can't tell you why it is, but the unfairness of it makes, I think, a reporter who has been in this business for more than 30 years, or more than 20 years, or more than 15 years, makes the reporter much more attuned to staying the course and getting those questions answered that he or she has. The reason why I think it's more of a problem to enter this field without that passion is because if you don't do it, if you don't have the passion, you don't have the sense of commitment to this type of story, then you'll be content with putting out the daily news, the he said, she said, which does not uphold the responsibility that we have as newspaper people. Our readers, our public is depending on us to calling as we see them and to getting below the blandishments of public officialdom. And that's what has made, I think, newspapers such a integral part of both the community and the democracy. And lastly, I think the rigors that we go through to get stories into the paper, the discipline, and that process assures that the passion does not get to drive unfair journalism. The stories we put in the paper that are, quote, make a difference, unquote, journalism, are there, present there because they have been vetted through several editing processes, through the requirements that they be fair, that the allegations be documented, that they be, and that there's multiple sources for any conclusion that's made there. And that assures the credibility of both that report and the paper itself. So I'm not worried about the filters by which this passion that drives the reporting in any way disturbs or tilts the reporting that shows up in the paper that we proudly work for. So, with that, I'll turn it over.
Steve, thank you. Helen, you're a columnist, and that's a part of the newspaper where writers are expected to have more latitude and to engage and to express point of view. It'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, please.
just like you said, Lou, as a columnist, I have the luxury, actually it's more of a privilege, of having a job where emotion is not just recommended but expected. And with that luxury comes a couple of responsibilities. It goes beyond making sure that you have the facts. That's a given. No matter whether you're a columnist or an investigative reporter, you have to have that base. But with a column, there has to be a payoff. With an emotional column as well, there has to be some sort of payoff. If you're bringing the reader along on this emotional ride, you have to sort of lead them somewhere. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lead them to a place that they agree with, but at the very least that they appreciate or understand sort of why you chose the topic, where you're headed, how you got to that conclusion. And I think probably the best way to explain that is just telling you a little bit of an example of one of my columns. A couple of years ago, Hartford was going through one of its unfortunate sort of cyclical phases of violence, where a lot of kids were dying on the streets. There were wars, gang wars, and all that stuff. And I went to one of what seemed to be an endless number of funerals. And I didn't necessarily think that I would write a column that day, though it's kind of silly to think that when you're writing 2 or 3 columns a week, every moment is a column pretty much. But I went there, and I remember sitting there and listening to folks talking. The politicians, of course, showed up because, the violence in Hartford had become a media event as well. People showed up all dressed to the nines. Everyone was getting up, and, the mayor was talking about there needs to be an end to the violence. Folks were getting up, talking about it takes a village. And I went from being mildly annoyed to having more of a controlled rage at hearing these folks talk about these things that they've talked about over and over and over again. And I ended up going back to the current and writing what ended up being sort of a letter to the village, basically telling this village that they'd failed once again, that we were all sitting at this funeral, and it was proof that we were just talking the talk and not doing anything about this violence that was basically eating our children. So when this column ran, I can't say that everybody agreed with it. I was very torn because part of being an emotional writer is advocacy. And I have long been an advocate of city issues, of issues having to do with poverty, diversity, and a lot of it comes from my own upbringing. I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up moving from one apartment building to another. Poverty and social issues and all that was very much part of my life. It's, I think, what brought me to journalism. It's definitely what has brought me to column writing. So as I was writing this, even I was torn because, it's supposed to be my role as a columnist, as an advocate, to look out for the underdog, to sort of see the side that a lot of people don't see because they've never lived lives like that. But to write anything other than sort of from that outrage, from that rage, would have been very insincere that day. So that's what I wrote. And as I said, not everyone understood that. I got lots of emails and letters from people saying, well, we thought that you, of all people, would understand. It's not so easy, to just say, oh, it takes a village and to save these kids and all that. And the reason I say that is just sort of to get into the dangers of writing from emotion or from passion. And I think the biggest one for me, especially being a columnist, is that often you can be clouded by your advocacy. It would have been very easy for me to sit there and justify why, once again, we were all sitting at a young man's funeral. Sitting there and justifying, once again, why politicians and community leaders were all talking of the very same thing they've always talked about. But I think you have to recognize sort of your gut feeling. You have to recognize where your passion and emotion is taking you. And that's what I did that day. So I think that you have to be careful that's one of the dangers. And I think there's a fine line between emotion and bias. And I think that Lou talked a little bit about that with Anderson and all that, and we'll get into that later. But although I have more leeway, I'm supposed to come with an opinion, I'm supposed to write from my opinion, I also have to be careful of that. I have to sort of check myself and realize that although I come from a certain upbringing, although I have certain biases, I have to make sure that I don't overlook the facts just because I can understand or I feel people's pain or I'm empathetic or sympathetic. But I think that there's another thing, too, about emotion, and I think that that's something that I'm learning as I go along, that emotion doesn't have to be absolute. And I think that That's something that we don't always get because we're sort of living in the O'Reilly Rush era where, you know, liberals are a bunch of pansies, conservatives are a bunch of evil ogres, or vice versa, depending on where you are. And I found this because often as a columnist, I go and I write about something, and I feel like I have to, if I'm coming to it with emotion, I have to sort of pick a side. And sometimes with emotion, there's ambivalence, and that's okay. And I think a recent example of that in my own work was probably 2 weeks ago. There was a settlement with the Hartford Archdiocese with some victims of sexual abuse, priests who sexually abused them. And I had done a couple columns. The first column I wrote was I talked to a couple of the survivors just about what they had gone through. And I was leaving the lawyer's office, and I turned the corner, and there's a big church that it was just an odd moment. And it's just sort of like, it's kind of called to me. And I grew up Catholic, and so this is just something I've always, wanted to understand. What is it that makes individuals act this way? To betray the most vulnerable in such a place. And I went to the church, and I told myself, I'm going to go there, I'm going to get an answer. I don't care who, if it's confession time, I'll sit there and go, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. Can you please explain this to me? I just wanted an answer. I was just my gut was torn up by just hearing the stories of these two men who, they're 30 and 40 and 50 years old, and you look at them, and really they're 4, 5, 12 years old. They're the little boys that they're talking about, And so my emotion brought me to that church in to the corner, and my emotion made me bang on the doors and yell out for somebody to come to me. Nobody came. The doors were locked. I couldn't get any answers, and that turned into a column. But it was the following day when I'm sitting at my desk, it's still sort of reading the stories and, talking to others who were sort of feeling the same way. There was one of the priests who was accused was a Hartford priest that I had, and I've been at the Current for 11 years, so, you start to get to know the players in the community. And one of the priests was he worked a lot with the gang kids, and he'd be a mediator if the Latin Kings wanted to fight, blah blah blah. He'd go in there and try to sort of calm everybody down. And he had basically been known for all the good work that he had done. So it was really hard to reconcile Father Lou, this good guy who had sort of saved so many kids' lives. He'd go to court when their parents wouldn't go to court. He literally saved people's lives, with this man who had abused this man that I had met a day earlier, Jim Hackett. And I was still sort of in that mode of I was very emotional still. I wanted to find out. I wanted someone to just I just wanted some explanation. So I thought, I'm going to go look for this guy. Nobody sort of knew where he was. We knew that he wasn't still an active, priest, but I thought, nothing to lose. And I went looking for him every other place except Hartford, because I was convinced there was no way this man was still in Hartford. I mean, come on, he was accused, the settlement, it was he had to have it. So I went to a bunch of different towns, and he was 4 minutes down the road. I ended up going all the way back to Hartford, and so I'm outside his door, and I have this moment of going, what am I doing here exactly? And I'm like, I could say I knocked. I could, and so I'm listening at the door because, I've been doing this for 11 years. You think, hey, no problem, knocking on the door. I want to ask you a couple questions. That's, that's not how I work. So I knocked on the door, and there's Lou. There's Father Lou. And I'm thinking, he's of course going to tell me to go, jump off a cliff or something. He leads me downstairs. He's cordial as can be, and I'm thinking he's going to lead me right out the door. But no, he leads me to a couch, and we have this discussion where I'm asking him, can you please, and he starts off with, I've done good work, and I'm like, I've heard that. That's not why I'm here. Explain to me how a man in the cloth can betray such vulnerable people. How can this happen? And he sort of stammered, and he was trying to explain, not really, and I realized it was like talking to someone about someone else. It was like he had buried this man so deep down inside of him that it was like he didn't even, it was like I was asking him about a neighbor, someone who had done something bad that he was trying to understand, but he couldn't quite explain to me. He couldn't answer any of my questions. I asked him, do you remember Jim Hackett? Vaguely, which was infuriating. Do you remember what you did to him? It was just so long ago, Helen. You're asking me about, and that's when I realized I'm asking him about a man that in his mind no longer exists. I left there that night, and it was the most uncomfortable, I was completely not satisfied. And I'm driving back home going, what am I supposed to write here? I'm supposed to say bad guy or good guy or, you can overcome your mistakes or second chance. And I had no answers, And I went back and I wrote this column that I got to tell you, there were no answers in there. I pretty much broke it down for the readers. This is what happened. I knocked on a door. We had this discussion. It was like talking to somebody about a man who no longer existed, or at least not in his head. The questions I had as I was driving away, can a lifetime or, 3 decades of good work, supposedly, overshadow these horrible moments? Are any sins unpardonable? I can't say I came up with any answers. It was all emotion. And I think that it was okay. It's okay to sort of have that ambivalence when you're writing from a passionate point of view. Sorry, I just rambled on sorry. That's it. Thanks.
Helen, that was terrific. Thank
Thanks.
you. That's interesting. Mark, you write for a national audience about issues of huge consequence, sometimes life and death, and for a publication that is known for writing from point of view, all the way back to its owner, founder, Henry Luce. Talk to us, please, about your experience and how you wrestle with these questions.
Luce with the truth, we used to call him. First of all, before I spew my 2 cents worth, I just want to thank BU for having us here. It was 30 years ago in May that I was graduated from down the street, and I come back, and what strikes me is everything on campus has changed except the physical infrastructure of the College of Communication. And thanks very much to Stephanie and Rob and Robin and Karen for putting this on. And I hope you all have an opportunity someday to be on this side of the table, because it's so gratifying to come back and to try to share with you some of what we have learned, not at the School of Public Communication, but at the School of Hard Knocks. We are not stenographers, but neither are we impresarios of anger. And that's the debate we're having today. Journalism is at a crossroads. It was at a crossroads when I was graduated from here. Then it was the recession, and could you get a job in journalism? Today the quest is, what kind of job in journalism do I want? Because there are so many venues open to you guys as content providers that we didn't have. But there's a reason we watched a film clip to open this session, because the passion of assembling a story in print does not translate onto the printed page. Heat defines television. Light defines the best print reporting. And the industry, I believe, is losing sight of that. When I was graduated from BUSPC, I went to work for a mass medium. It is now becoming crass tedium. If you look at the debate that the nation's newspapers, magazines are now having, it is, my God, how can we get our eyeballs back? How can we get more readers? How can we get more viewers? How can we get more listeners? And I would argue that's the wrong debate to have, because that's a race to the bottom, and it is a race that the press will lose. When my grandfather was reading the New Haven Register every day, my father was reading the Providence Journal every day, that doesn't happen so much in families anymore. Television, and not merely television, but info news, has filled a lot of that vacuum. And we reporters, at our peril, count on everybody reading us as if that is the barometer for our success. And it's not, because if it is, we're going to go down that sewer of the lowest common denominator. As a reporter, I want only to present the truth. Yes, the press can be, especially in Washington, be too deferential to power. There's been scant accountability by either the press or the Congress, who has subcontracted this war out to the White House, or, God forbid, the Bush administration on this issue, on the issue of why we are at war in Iraq. The press played along, and yesterday both Don and Tom, in our afternoon session, spoke of how the nation was basically jinxed by 9/11, and how that changed sort of the thinking of the body politic and where the corporate temperature is. And basically, folks remain anxious and remain pretty nervous. While that is dissipating, it still remains something you can feel in the body politic, and I think that accounts for a lot of what led us, in hindsight, inevitably down the road into Iraq. But I think the job of the real reporters in this crowd, and real reporters everywhere, is not to beat up on your sources. I think we need to think of ourselves as fine window glass. And when you go to Beacon Hill and see that old purplish glass where it was snapped off after it was blown and it's sort of distorting, and you go, wow, that's really neat and that's really old, but what's on the other side of that window isn't as clear as you might like it to be. So as a reporter, it is our job to strive for a fine piece of tempered glass that renders what is on the other side to our viewers and our readers a clear picture of what's going on. The press at its best is a crowbar. We don't wield it like a club, but we brandish it in subtle and physical and important ways to try to extract the truth from those who might try to hide it from us. There is a pent-up emotion in the press right now. 9/11 triggered the unease. The war in Iraq, after $200 billion and 2,000 American lives, is beginning to trigger anger. And Katrina was the pin that popped the balloon. Those three things are sort of junctions that the press has gone through in the last 4 years. And I think we're going to see a settling out over the next 4 years that will, to some degree, return us to a sense of equilibrium that we had in the immediate wake of the end of the Cold War, and then that we had during the Cold War. But it's a very interesting time to be a reporter. It's a very interesting time to try to test your theses as a reporter in terms of what's important and how much of myself do I show in my stories. Time magazine used to be very clear about where it stood when Henry Luce was running the magazine and up through the 50s and into the 60s. That has dissipated. That is no longer the way it is, although there is, to this day, a degree of snarkiness in the magazine that I don't always subscribe to, but then again, I don't write that way. At the front of the book, we try to be we try to lay claim on the truth to which we can see it. You know, the daily journalists try to give you the rough first draft of history, and I try to edit their draft and get it out a week later, which is strange in these days of the internet. But of course, when you look at daily newspapers, when you look at weekly magazines or monthly magazines, in some ways, I don't know about you guys, but every once in a while I get blogged out. And every once in a while I need a Boston Globe, a Hartford Courant, a New York Times, or a Time magazine to sort of say, this is what is important. Remember, a lot of the heat that's being generated in what is called journalism is being generated by people who are not journalists at all. And it is important for us to differentiate and to have and to rebuild that Berlin Wall. And then on one side of it, put Bill O'Reilly, great alum that he is, Howard Stern, great alum that he is, Rush Limbaugh, Michael Moore, Jon Stewart. And then the other side of that wall, put the ink-stained wretches like us who get lots of psychic income from what we do because we're out there trying to hunt down the best obtainable version of the truth. and it changes over time, and we shouldn't be afraid to go back, unlike this administration, and recognize from where we came and where we are now and why those two places are different and how we got there. So anyway, thanks for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Mark, thank you. We would like to open it to questions now, and I'd ask that you move to the microphones, and then also Rob in the back has a microphone that he can bring to you. So please, questions. Okay, I guess you'll move to that. Yeah, good. Can you identify yourself so we know who you are? And
yes, my name is
right
Catherine, and I'm an alum from 2001. And my question is, to what extent do you think us as journalists need to lead the readers to the blame game? You know, I'm angry at this person, so you should be too, and this is why, fact, fact, fact. Or do you think it's more important that we report what we know and allow our emotions to get involved a little bit, but don't necessarily lead them on the blame game?
Good question for the panel. Steve, do you want to start?
The issue of who's responsible and how they became responsible is an absolute essential part of the story. And it, you know, there may be a great difference between the word blame and accountability, but unless we hold people accountable for their public failings in public policy, then I don't think that we're shedding the light that we're supposed to shed. But in the same way, we've got to do it with factual data and not sourcing, just sourcing. Sources are good to take you to get you the lead, get you the idea, get you the you know, the trigger you into the issue. But that just starts the journalist in the paper, the media outlet, to getting after the story. But an essential part of that, what is the story about, is who is responsible and how did it get this way.
Others on the panel, would you like a shot at it?
I think it would be dishonest for us as journalists. If we know who's responsible, who's accountable, it's our role, it's our duty, I think, to make sure that we not only lead the reader, but put it out there. This is who is responsible for this. This is who is accountable.
Good. Yes.
Hi, my name is Phil Goldstein. I'm a freshman in comm. I guess this question is more specific and can probably be best answered by Mr. Thompson. On a national correspondent level, it's becoming increasingly clear that the country and the media were pretty much duped going into the Iraq War. Do you think that it's the media's responsibility to cross a line of objectivity to both, I guess, sort of lay the responsibility both at the media's feet for reporting about weapons of mass destruction before the war and sort of bring the responsibility and the onus to this deception both back to the administration and to Congress?
Duped is an interesting word, Philip. Listen, I don't know if we were duped, but plainly facts were mislaid. And I think it is the press's responsibility. We're seeing it happen slowly, far more slowly than lots of people would want, especially those with sons and daughters in uniform. I think it's important that, as Steve mentioned, you know, you say blame game and people have one reaction. You say accountability and there's another whole reaction, even though they're synonyms. Or is it homonyms? No, synonyms. And I think it's important that we, as reporters, that, you know, we tell our stories on a stage, and we want the curtains and the drapes to look nice. So let's use the word accountability. They'll use blame game in cable TV, but let the real reporter say, listen, Mr. President, all we want is accountability. That's not too much to ask. But in your question, Philip, you mentioned the press and you mentioned basically the administration. But I think we are all letting Congress way too far off the hook here. We let them off the hook with LBJ and the Gulf of Tonkin, We have seen a repeat here. Whenever this nation goes to war, Congress must declare war. We ignore that rule at our peril. We keep ignoring it. What is this Congress passing a resolution allowing the president to do whatever he wants vis-a-vis Iraq? Not only is it a blank check, it's a blank check with no money in the account to pay it, so that when it gets difficult to prevail, those wimps on the Hill can say, Mr. President, you misled us. Well, I'm sorry, you issued the check, Mr. Senator and Miss Congresswoman, so that won't wash with me. I think there's plenty of responsibility to go around, and I think the press, slowly but surely, is leading this pig by the ring in its nose to the trough of accountability. I'm just not sure how long it will take to bring that hog there.
Other questions for the panel? Yes.
My name is Amy. I'm a junior in comm. I wondered, as a columnist, if you're ever afraid to change your opinion because people look to you for your opinions. Is there any time where you feel afraid that you'll upset these people who feel like they have confidence in you and what you say?
Well, she has two bylines, you know. She has two, right, don't you, Helen?
Yeah, sure. I think that, yeah, that definitely is part of what I've been going through. Now, I'm a relatively new columnist. It's I think 3 years with this column. I've written another type before, but I think one of the examples I brought up during the opening remarks was definitely a situation that you described. Like I said, I very much write from the experience of the underdog of communities that lack in certain resources and services, and so I think often people expect that I'm going to sort of write from that point of view, meaning that sitting there in a funeral, I would write something where I'm feeling not outrage against the community, but perhaps outrage against the circumstances that led this little boy to be killed. And when I said that some people didn't agree, what happened was that the community very much did not agree with my take. They very much felt betrayed, thinking, like I said, we thought that you, of all people, would understand. But I think, and I said this before, that it would be very dishonest of me, and I think people can see it. They can sort of see how insincere, how dishonest you're being when basically you're fabricating emotion. I had to be true with what I was feeling then, and it wasn't outrage at the politicians, and it wasn't outrage at the circumstances, and it wasn't outrage at the social ills that lead people to have lives like this. It was outrage at the community itself, at the mothers and fathers and ministers who stood up there funeral after funeral saying the same thing and not doing a damn thing about it to change anything. So I knew that I was going to get some flack. I knew that people were going to be upset. I knew that, I have a lot of sources in the community. I knew that I was probably going to lose some of that. But I knew that it probably wouldn't last because, like I said, people can see right through sort of the fabricated emotion. And I knew that while they may not agree, they could see that I meant it, that I was sincere. So I hope that answers your question.
Let me add a postscript, if I might, that might add a little bit here as well. I teach a course in column writing here at BU, and I find that the single biggest challenge for me as a teacher when it comes to columns is getting students to develop the confidence to have a point of view. And it's a more difficult problem than clarity of writing and so many other issues. And what I find with students and with myself as well is the way to confidence is to gather information. And as you learn a lot about something, you begin to understand why something is or why something isn't. And when you check that information against your own value system, that's when I think you come to judgment about something and find it possible to write a column and have a point of view. Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Kate Shaflin-Kahn. I'm an adjunct at COM in the broadcast department. And I kind of you began by showing a video clip, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about the and let me just say, I'm not an Anderson Cooper fan, and I think his meteoric rise is dangerous in all sorts of ways, especially if he, you know, sees it as a license to use his emotion to become unobjective. But there's a big difference obviously between broadcast and print, in that broadcast is in your face. And as you guys have all stated, passion is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing when reporting, as long as you don't lose your objectivity. But it can make you be a better reporter. My question is, there were a lot of other television reporters that suddenly have skyrocketed to fame based on their emotional reports from Katrina. Ashley Banfield did it at 9/11 and then sank like a bomb. And my question is, I look at that report and I look at some of the other broadcasters who became emotional, and I think, you know, there's a lot of criticism that can go with that, but the bottom line is they were reporting what they saw. They were reporting the frustration that they saw, and they were he was trying to hold somebody accountable for some answers, just like trying to get that tempered glass, that beautiful tempered glass, trying to pry some answers out. And I'm not sure that showing that kind of emotion is a bad thing. It will be bad if he gets carried away with it and loses perspective. But I'm not sure it's a bad thing. It's just in your face because it's broadcast. So, your thoughts?
Go ahead, Steve. You have the face made for television.
Radio. You know, if you want to dissect that piece, Anderson did not come off in the traditional journalistic way of being able to elegantly carry off a phrase. He stumbled and stammered and showed the emotion. For some stories, I do think for television that's okay. The problem, I think, for him will be, like others, if he's going to try to manufacture that emotion on a daily thing, and he will become Geraldo-like or, sink like others have. The need to have engagement between the source and the person, the reporter, I think it's a good thing on television. I think it just can get overwrought. It can be too much heat, but I like seeing the well-tailored, well-versed, scripted politicians that are cookie-cut and present up in Congress and in the Senate, unfortunately, get shown in a tug of war, because that's what happens when you interview them in their offices. You're really pushing them. So I like to see them getting knocked around a little bit more than traditionally. It's power game in the way that they are coddled by the press in Washington does not make for strong news for honestness.
Good. Other questions? Yes, Susan.
Hi, Susan Walker. I teach broadcast journalism. I'm interested in the rules of engagement involving conflict of interest and how it carries over to your personal life. Do you vote? Are you friends with your sources? Do you have a wife or a husband who works for a politician? Do you give to a pro-life group? Do you give to a pro-choice group? I worked with a reporter once who did not vote because he did not want to show any bias. And part of me is thinking, boy, that's taking an educated voter out of the system. I'm just interested in how you approach this issue.
Let's run right down the list.
Not voting, I think, is silly. It's kind of like not going to church. You do not forsake all of your responsibilities as a citizen when you pick up the cudgel of the First Amendment. But Financially, you know, there can be, I covered the military for a long time, and I just didn't own any defense stocks. My wife is a real person, so, you know, she's a school teacher, so I don't have any of those sort of problems. You do see, I mean, nowadays you can go on the web and plug in somebody's name and see to whom he or she has given money. And there are way too many journalists on that list, even very teeny tiny amounts, because it was a neighbor, because he was my college roommate. I think that's wrong. I think it gets back to the whole notion of objectivity. And that is part of the problem you get when you have television and you have news reporters on shows volunteering their opinions. It began too early for most of you folks when Sam Donaldson was covering the White House for ABC, and yet was on This Week with David Brinkley spewing off about the events of the day. That was really a crack, and it's a crack that's become a chasm. And I think it's part of the problem with what's affecting our business, which is, are you church or are you state? You can't be both. And I think all of us reporters should hew to that line and stay clear on one side or the other side of it.
Helen, do you want to take a try at that?
You know, it sounds silly, but I think it's just common sense. My husband works in insurance, and so thankfully I don't cover insurance, as fascinating as I pretend the topic is over dinner. But if ever there was a case where, God help me, I have to, you know, cover something like that, I'd make sure, you know, I just can't do that. You know, he works for a huge company in Hartford, and that just wouldn't. Plus, I actually, during 9/11, if I'm remembering this correctly, he would remember it more because he was more horrified at my actions. One of the stories that we were after, sort of how the insurance companies were dealing with the security issues and all that, and they tried to send me off to some of the insurance companies, and of course I'm like, well, I have an in. My husband works at the insurance company. The man would not let me in the front door. They didn't need security. It was my husband going, you are not coming in here. So I think you just have to, you know when there's a conflict. You know, it's so clear. But I wanted to just briefly, if I could, go back to the Anderson clip. I don't really have a problem with Anderson. We talked over dinner. I think he's quite pretty. But I didn't have an issue at all with the emotion. And I not only appreciated sort of the in-your-face way it sort of came across. I think that the whole disaster was in your face. There was no other way to sort of cover that story, I think, appropriately, emotion-wise, without it, you know, other than being in your face. What I had a problem with is what came after, which is when it sort of tipped over to, it went from being emotional to people sort of going with their biases, meaning they were willing to buy these stories, these outrageous stories that were coming out of you know, the rapes and the murders and all that stuff because, you know, they were apparently so emotional. They were buying stories that in no other situation would any respected journalist ever buy because they were so distraught and passionate and emotional about the events that they were just like, well, if they're telling us this is happening, well, of course it's happening. So I think I had more of a problem with the lack of responsibility that came after that. So.
Could I talk a little bit of conflict of interest because most newspapers have hard and fast rules about what reporters and editors and photographers and anybody in the news side of the business can do. I think they also apply to the business side, but they absolutely prohibit any contributions to any political or advocacy group to appear at any panel or even at colleges, universities. You have to go and let the managing editor in charge of administration know that you're going to be there and you're going to be speaking, and that's okay, but not for any causes, and that's well known throughout the news, through our newsroom, and I'm certain throughout the businesses. You don't want to do anything stupid. You don't want to be doing anything that could give readers or less or biased individuals a belief that the paper is selling its credibility to one cause or another.
Do we have some more questions?
Lou?
Oh, yes, Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Daly. I'm a professor of journalism here after spending, I don't know, about 25 years working in the business at the Associated Press and at the Washington Post. And I'd like to air out an issue that I often thought about when I was doing that kind of work, because I would sometimes have very strong feelings. But, you know, as a reporter, if you work in one of these mainstream operations, there is a division of labor. There's a division of labor within the industry, which is that some places, usually like magazines, are allowed to have and show their passions or opinions or to advocate things. But other institutions, like the Washington Post's news pages and the AP, certainly are not allowed to have or show opinions or emotions. But in fact, a lot of people do have them and kind of work surreptitiously through the conventions of mainstream journalism to get them out there. And a lot of times this involves what I think of as kind of a dirty little secret in the business, which is you go find somebody who will say what you were thinking all along. And this kind of reflects, I think, the basic reality, which is that mainstream press is much more comfortable covering the opposition than it is in being the opposition. And this just brings me back to the point I think Mark was making earlier about Congress, where after 9/11, there was no opposition to cover. So I think that accounted for a lot of that silence. We really depend on other people to say the things that we would love to quote them as saying. You know what I mean? I think this is something that a lot of us would acknowledge if we were really candid about it, that we do go shopping around for people who will express the thing we wanted to say in the first place.
Well, I think that's right, Chris. It is important to realize that, for lack of a better phrase, the legitimate press is a megaphone. And a megaphone by itself makes no noise. It can only amplify what other people are saying. And that, of course, in the wake of 9/11 was a key vacuum that persisted in this country. In terms of going around looking for somebody to say what you secretly believe in your heart of hearts, I mean, I read and love the AP, and it is pretty much right down the middle. As you get into newspapers and more so into magazines, if you read them with any degree of acuity, you will see generally that they have a take. It's not a spin, it's not a strong point of view, but it's a knowing wink or a knowing nod. You can tell by the words they choose, be it pro-life or pro-abortion, or you can see it especially in the debate over a Supreme Court nominee. And now we've got all these nerdy do-gooder groups who are constantly slicing and dicing stories and saying, this is a left-wing screed, or this is a right-wing harangue. And if you read enough of those websites, you realize that, you know, the press is really like the fulcrum in a teeter-totter, and yeah, it goes this way, and yeah, it goes that way. You can look at Fox TV and realize, gee, the press isn't liberal. And then you sort of look maybe at some newspapers which tend to be more liberal than conservative. I think it pretty much all comes out in the wash.
Good, thank you. Do we have some other questions? Yes.
I'm Jennifer Sheffield. I'm a first-year graduate student in comm. Venata of the New York Times last night suggested that the press gave the president a big chance after 9/11. This is probably best answered by Thompson as well. Now that the tables are turning and that chance is kind of being pulled out from underneath the president, how do we start getting serious again? Now that we are getting serious, how do we convey that in what appear to be on television to be pretty chummy press conferences and give the public the confidence again that we are getting the answers in an era that the public not necessarily trusts the press to be people where they, because they don't trust us, because we are going to the Georgetown parties and that sort of thing. How do we let the public know that we are getting the answers and we are getting serious again, and even let the president know during those press conferences that these are starting to be real serious questions?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think right now the Bush administration is like that cartoon character you used to see on Saturday mornings who ran off the cliff. And so long as he or she didn't look down, he didn't fall. I think that's sort of where we're at this moment. And I think the next press conference is going to be a lot tougher than those that came before. I think, as Don said last night, when he was in London, he was amazed at the fervor and the fierceness of press questioning in Britain compared to the United States. But let's face facts. This president holds very few press conferences. I've been covering administration since Jimmy Carter. Never have I seen one as niggardly with facts as this one. And what has that done to this administration? Well, it's made it very brittle. If we can take another metaphor, it's like steel, you know. These folks are, you know, cast iron. You're going to hit it and it's going to shatter. They've got absolutely no resilience. And I think that that's the danger for the next 3 years for this country, is that the goodwill that once existed for this administration in the wake of 9/11 has gone away. And they have frittered it away by their actions, by their refusal to hold anybody accountable for the snafu in which we now find ourselves. And I think, I feel sad to some degree for the president, because the press is going to come back with a lot of vengeance to make up for lost time. And that's a problem. We should have been more awake at the switch earlier on, so we wouldn't have to overcompensate now. But I fear we will now overcompensate, which isn't going to win us a lot of plaudits from the public. And it'll just be interesting to see how that unfolds in the weeks and months to come.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Zach Janowski, and I'm a senior at BU. I'm just curious, a lot of people talk about the bias in the media, and some people claim that there is no bias in the media, but I was wondering, my take on it is I think it's an admitted bias is better than a denied bias because everyone has them. I'm just wondering what your take on that was.
Is there a particular panelist you'd like to direct your question toward?
Whoever feels like.
Okay. Steve, you've been nominated.
Thank you very much. We all have our biases in our things that compel us as far as news, but the process that exists in all media outlets is that every report, traditional media outlets, is the reporter has a set of editors that he is responsible to. And those editors have their own biases, but there's a lot of balancing of biases going on. And there's it's a very vibrant self-evaluation process that goes on in the newsroom that makes sure that a person who may be tilting or may have his or her own individual biases to a particular subject gets addressed. That gets very quickly addressed by his or her editors, and it gets weeded out. I think the story selections, though, that reporters do come forward with is something that's more difficult to address. If I'm on a beat and I feel that if I'm on the State House beat and I feel that one of the important issues up at the State House that hasn't getting enough attention is the environment, and I happen to believe fervently that industry has the upper hand in the environment, I'm going to be continually bringing good stories to my editors about the environment. One will get by, two will get by. By the third time that I come in with an environmental story, the editor is going to say, let's go back to the issue of jobs. And so the 2 or 3 stories that I have provided, they're all going to be fully vetted, fully reported out, so that they're going to be fair and accurate. But by the 3rd or 4th time that I come forward with a story that comes out of my biases, the editor say, well, you know, we're clogging up the news pages on one issue. Let's get back to something else.
Do we have some other questions? Okay, and we're just about out of time. Let me say, as faculty and as students, I think we're very lucky. We're fortunate to have alumni, such as our 3 guests here today, who come with such a distinguished record, Pulitzer Prize winners, and who can share with us their insights into the business. It makes for a very rich conversation, and please join me in thanking them. That concludes the program, and I think Steve, Helen, and Mark will be up here for a few more minutes if you want to come on up and say hello and ask a couple of other questions. Thank you again.